move on to our second panel of today. This morning, we explored the new social contract we have to negotiate as humans if we want to develop and integrate what can be considered moral machines. Now, we want to explore how the machines we make in turn affect our social lives and change several industries. Particularly, the notion of prediction is of interest and how those predictions lead to decisions being made increasingly in a hybrid way between humans and machines. And for this discussion, I have the pleasure of welcoming a panel of representatives from 3 different industries. I look forward to speaking to the CEO of the insurance company Techniker Krankenkasse, Dr. Jens Baas. Welcome, Dr. Baas. The CEO of energy giant EnbW, Dr. Frank Mastiaux. Welcome, Dr. Mastiaux, and the Senior Research Fellow at the University of the German Armed Forces in Munich and Head of Research at the Metis Institute for Strategy and Foresight, Dr. Frank Sauer. Welcome to Dr. Sauer as well. Welcome to the 3 of you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I would first like to take a look at how technologies are affecting your 3 respective fields in more detail. Jens Baas, I would like to start with you. Various digital applications in the shape of AI, robotics, virtual reality are being used in patient care, in support of diagnostics, for example, and therapy. Can you share some concrete examples of how these systems are actually changing the healthcare sector so that we all have a common understanding?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's really a very important topic to see how AI, how digitalization is changing the healthcare system, because healthcare obviously is affecting all of us. If we look at what's happening already today, we already do see those kind of changes. In the talk before, when we heard how RNA could be used for data storage, if you look how data is changing the daily provision of care, we can already see big impacts. You may have read in the news over the last couple of days that the human genome for the first time is really cartographed 100%, which for medical purposes brings completely new appliances where we can actually change the provision of care to the people. If we look at the possibility to use all kind of data for therapeutic or for diagnostic approaches, there's really a complete change in the world. We all are carrying devices like a watch or an iPhone or stuff like that. And I always tell my students a very easy example. When I was a young doctor, we learned about the window shopper's disease. Window shopper disease is a disease of the arteries in the leg. And the name comes from how many windows can you walk before your leg starts to hurt. That's what you learned as a young doctor. Today, everybody uses an iPhone or any other kind of device that's always counting the steps. So you don't need that question anymore. You have that data. That's a very, very simple example. But if you look what kind of data we do have in addition, we have completely new ways of bringing a diagnosis to the patient.
Now, let's look at you mentioned the example of data and having lots of data. There are obviously various technologies who use a lot of data to assist in therapy. I'm wondering, it's one thing to say that this will help patients, for example. It obviously also helps doctors, I assume. I'm wondering how that will change the work of healthcare professionals and, their interactions with patients. What do you think is the human side of what you just described?
Well, my physician colleagues always don't like it if I say it like that, but I'm deeply convinced that within a couple of years, it will be illegal to make a diagnosis without additionally consulting an AI. I think the physician would still be responsible because you need to have some kind of, let's say, plausibility checks on the results that an AI is giving you. But it will be malpractice if you actually do a diagnosis without consulting an AI first. And that's going to change within the next couple of years. So what we will see is AI will become another tool that the physician can use. It will not make the physician unnecessary. I think the provision of medical care is always as much an art as it is in science. But for the science part, it will be an additional instrument, and it will be one of the most valuable instruments we have seen over the last decades. I always compare it with the introduction of penicillin or stuff like that. It will be a very, very valuable tool, but the physician will still be the one who's responsible for using that tool.
That's a very interesting point, that it might become illegal to not consult technology. I would actually love to hear, and let's see if the other sectors would actually reflect that as well. Frank Mastiaux, let's turn to the energy sector. When it comes to this realm of resources that we all depend on, that the planet even depends on, where do you see the most cutting-edge applications that people should really be aware of?
Well, I think the examples I would bring are of very practical nature. You highlighted the importance of the energy system as such, and there has been a dramatic change in a sense of way more complexity, to the degree that we moved from a few power plants, for example, to hundreds of thousands decentralized sources of energy like solar panels. And we have an increased number of grids and networks that we have to manage for gas, power, and water, reaching an even more increasing number of people in a very ever-changing consumption pattern. And in order to keep that system stable, we have plenty of applications to make life easier and keep things under control. And three little things I can mention is, for example, a predictive maintenance for the well-being of an installation that is, for example, offshore. In the past, you would wait until something breaks down and you head out with the operations and maintenance people and have to repair it. Today, we have technology that predicts from behavior of, say, the vibration pattern of the wind turbine, an upcoming issue that might pop up in the gearbox or something, and we can go out and do something about it before actually the hazard happens. A second example would be the complexity of moving electricity in grids with very small little bits and pieces taken off by electric cars or by going in by the mentioned solar panels. And you could use hundreds of thousands of sensors to understand what is the system stability and do I have to feed in more or less electricity. There are ways now today to observe local patterns by AI that gives you a good sense in a predictive way what is the next whatever X minutes, hours looking alike, and the system stability can be taken. And the last one I would use from the consumer front, you obviously have to work with millions of data sets every day. If you serve, in our case, 5.5 million customers, and there's obviously, they are prone for error, these transactions, in the sense of you have a meter reading, sometimes taking analog, somebody's writing down a piece of paper and a postcard and sends it in, and things can go wrong. Today, we have a plausibility check done by AI that checks, is it plausible that this meter of this customer shows this, say, kilowatt hour number? And it has made life incredibly easy for our people who, if and when an inconsistency pops up, they don't have to go through all the data, which is quite tedious and time-consuming. So there's a whole raft, and I've only picked a few examples of technology that already today allows us to manage the system as complex as it is.
So I want to stick with you, Dr. Mastiaux, for a second. You mentioned predictive systems and AI systems can, for example, improve energy generation and consumption. But it, like other technologies very relevant for your energy sector, let's say like the blockchain, we will probably talk about that later, they require quite extensive resources with a significant environmental impact themselves. So how do you consider the balance between technology actually improving energy efficiency to help ameliorate climate change versus the resource depletion by technology?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a brilliant point. I'm actually, again, it was mentioned before, people might not like what I say. Jens said this before. So on this note, in your question, I'm concerned about the extensive allocation of resource depletion by any use of technical developments. Blockchain is the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. Any storage of data at the consumptions level that we have. And I guess to circumvent this is obviously system optimization in a technical sense. So how do you perform these digital activities in a technically most sophisticated way? And secondly, I believe we need to put a price tag on use of technology when it consumes energy, in particular storage. When I walk through a museum and I see people taking like 50 pictures a minute of everything that happens, you can immediately see these people have no clue that there is a price tag to the working with the data that they're created. They have to be put in the cloud and stored somewhere. I guess people would be more cognizant of the use of these devices if there would be a price tag to it. So that would be my clear position.
Interesting. So a note of concern from Frank Mastiaux, and I like the phrasing of the price tag. And actually, Frank Sauer, your area of expertise is certainly one that has a different kind of price tag because it's about life and death. You have a sector with very obvious moral implications. You research the impact of emerging technologies such as AI and robotics on military applications, especially in counterterrorism and cybersecurity efforts. And obviously, in this field, these decisions are often being made with regards, as I said, to life or death, and they certainly are always with regards to safety and security of human beings. Actually, last week, the UN issued a report about lethal autonomous weapons that were programmed to attack targets in Libya without any data connectivity between the human operator and the munition. So basically, if anyone died in this attack, it would likely represent a sort of historic first known case of AI-based systems being used to kill. So when we look at an example like this, at automating such an ethically really heavy decision, what are some of the most significant technologies that we must consider?
That's a great question, Leah. Thanks for that, and thanks for having me. Indeed, that UN report that you mentioned, it made a lot of headlines. It didn't clearly say if anybody actually was killed by that weapon systems, nor did it clearly state if there was a connection at the time of the attack between the weapon system itself and the remote operator. But getting hung up on these questions now, I think, would be pretty much besides the point with regard to our panel here today, because I think the key takeaway, what I think the story has made clear to a broader public, is that in a military context, also the technology is here now. In fact, it's been here for quite some time. These loitering munitions, such as the ones used in Libya, they've been around for at least a decade, 2 decades even. And you can trace weapon autonomy even further back than that. So it's high time for us to agree on some rules for the road regarding how we want to be using this technology in a military context. But your question was about the role of specific technologies. And here, clearly we're seeing that AI-enabled technologies such as computer vision, which is also the main variable in loitering munitions, such as the cargo that was used in Libya, they are turbocharging autonomous functionality of weapon systems and have been doing so in recent years. And this means, in effect, that there is a growing number of circumstances where a machine, rather than a human, is selecting and engaging targets on the battlefield based on software, based on algorithms.
Well, but now not everything that is technically possible, right? Let's say through computer vision and prediction and being able to find out the sort of perfect target, and that will be possible in the future also, is ethically justifiable and necessarily useful for humans, right? So let's take a look at the sort of ethical boundaries in each of your fields. Let's stick with you for a second. Frank Sauer, yours is one where even without the use of automation and prediction, the question of morals is pretty much in every decision. When we stick to that UN report or the general topic of lethal autonomous weapon systems, where do you draw the boundary? What is the ethical fault line? Where should we really not be delegating these decisions to machines?
Well, first of all, I think it's clear that militaries will be heavily investing in automation. And it's not only the tip of the spear, so to say, it's not only the weapon systems themselves, the use of force. It will affect many, many fields. We've heard about predictive maintenance, for instance. That is also a big issue for militaries. And we're talking logistics, we're talking data processing. And there's another thing that I should maybe make up clear up front. Even in weapon systems, automation is not necessarily a bad thing. That's why it's so important to look at this in a very differentiated, context-dependent manner. So for one, you want to be able to defend against incoming munitions, incoming missiles, rockets, artillery shells, maybe in the near future, hypervelocity munitions, right? That are very fast, Mach 5 and upwards. And so you need automation to defend against incoming, things that harm people. But in cases where your own actions put human life at stake, you need to involve human beings in the decision-making process leading up to the use of force. Because it's not only a legally tricky question. We've got laws of war, international humanitarian law. So delegating decisions to machines is legally a very tricky thing. It's also, in terms of international stability and peace and arms races, it's also, concerning. But I think, and this is where we're getting to the meat of the matter here, really, and to the ethical issue. It is, as you correctly said, it's a life and death issue, and it's a question of human dignity. So in short, that's where I would draw the line for the battlefield. We should not delegate life and death decisions to machines. The least thing we can do if we kill people on the battlefield is to put that decision on our own human conscience.
Thank you for that nuance. That's also very clarifying to say that automation in defense is actually very helpful, but in attack, there should always be a human involved. Jens Baas, in the healthcare sector, you too obviously inherently deal with sensitive personal data, if not also with life and death, but certainly with kind of sensitive personal data, and at times also really private, difficult situations for patients involved. And interestingly, we actually have a question that came up in the chat about this sort of the privacy and the data of it all. So I'll read this out. Maike is asking, when she thinks about the discussions that we had this morning, which was about the question of who should really have the power over these systems, she asks, is it not only useful, but also worrying if we put our health in the hands of AI? So how would you respond to that? How do you balance the need, on the one hand, for digital innovation, but also the need for privacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, it's one of the most or the biggest concerns we do have. It has two aspects. Aspect one is who owns the data. If I'm a patient, if I'm some kind of person who has health data, you might also be healthy, who does own this data? And our answer is it can only be owned by the person himself or herself. So if I'm a patient, I should be the one who has full control over his or her data. I think that's point number one. And that's something that is very important because it can differentiate us from the approaches we do see in the US and also from the approaches we do see in China. So I think that this could be a European way to have some kind of healthcare system that does acknowledge that your personal healthcare data does actually belong to you. More problematic is the second point. Who's going to be responsible? And I can bring you a very short example. When I started talking to the physicians associations a couple of years ago and trying to convince them that we need an electronic patient record, they were very happy and said, oh, that's great. We have an electronic patient record. That's a great idea. Let's do that. We do that together. It will help us in our work. We do that. Then a week later, I went to them and said, we thought about it. Maybe it's not such a good idea. And I said, what has changed? And last week, you told us it's a good idea. Now you're telling me it's not a good idea. What has changed? And I said, yeah, well, if there is this electronic patient record and then there's a lot of data in it, is the physician going to be responsible for reading all those kind of data? And if he doesn't, is that malpractice? And that's a valid concern, because if there's a lot of data, who's going to be responsible? And that brings us to the question of AI. I think in the future, there is going to be an artificial intelligence that's, for example, going through all the data that a patient collects over his lifetime and makes some kind of a summary, and that summary will be presented to the physician, and the physician will be responsible to check it for plausibility, if it makes sense or not. Because, and the question that's implied, and therefore it's a great question, of course, an AI is not perfect. It doesn't have to be malicious. It can just be wrongly taught. We know a lot of AIs are taught with data that's somehow biased in terms of male or women, biased in terms of social structures, biased in terms of people of color. And if an AI is trained with wrong data, the results will always be wrong. So you need to have somebody who's going to have a plausibility check over the data, and that's going to be the physician. Actually, that's the role of a physician already today. If you look at a CT picture or an MRI picture, you can't just say it's a picture. So I believe 100% that's true. You have to make a plausible check. Is that what I believe I can see really possible that I do see it? And so there's always going to be someone who needs to look over the results of an AI and say, well, it's plausible or not. And of course, there will be errors, but let's be frank, there are a lot of errors in the treatment of patients today.
Absolutely. And let's stick to the topic of challenges and risks of technologies for just a second. Frank Mastiaux, I see a bit of a combination of the other two sectors in your own field, actually, because on the one hand, you also deal with sensitive resources in the sense that we are dependent on them. And they are also an infrastructure that is vulnerable to attack. Hopefully not a military attack, but we've actually witnessed multiple actually, very recently. For example, in the US Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. So I would love to understand what kinds of risks do we face when we have our critical infrastructure completely digitized, completely turned into various technological systems and partly also in the cloud. What kinds of challenges do you see?
Starting with the obvious, the more digital transaction you allow and the more digital display, if you like, of the data system happens, the more obviously you invite and give inroads and avenues for digital approaches, call it attack. So structurally, with more digitization, the risk for digital attacks goes up. And to do something about it, and as you mentioned one prominent case of recent times, but it happens every day that infrastructure businesses and companies are attacked, and firewalls and the security systems around can count them in thousands a day per company. The critical issue is the defense mechanism, its sophistication, the ever changing adaptation that you need to have. It's a mouse and cat, as you would say, race. And we just try our utmost to keep up with the technologies and, not surprisingly, allow on purpose people to attack us, to train and educate. That's one area. The second area, which is the more tricky one possibly, is the hybrid situation between physical attack and digital. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you can have a very powerful digital defense system within the digital world. You can have a very powerful physical protection in the physical world, say in a simplest way, a wall people cannot climb over. But there are increasing elements at the interface of the two systems that use a physical structure and a digital structure that then can be attacked in that hybrid situation. I guess this particular area is another matter of concern where both parts of physical and digital work need to work and collaborate, come up with defense system and mechanisms that address this hybrid situation. And I can assure you it's common practice from all the infrastructure providers I know. Do you have ever 100% assurance nothing can ever go wrong? It would be stupid to say this. Mm-hmm. The only thing you can do is you can focus on it as a tip-top priority. And for example, the data security officer in our company is a direct report to the board. And the attention to this matter is incredibly high. The investments are high, the focus on this. But it is a tough one because people are creative, as we have seen of late.
Yet another form of hybrid evolution, which is the topic of today's conference, the hybridity between a physical and a digital attack. Well, Frank Mastiaux mentioned a cat and mouse race. I want to talk about a different kind of race, and that is the arms race of AI. Frank Sauer, we actually have a question in the chat about this. Arash asks, globally, some of the most advanced countries in terms of military have shown significant developments in these fields of testing and usage of AI. Will Germany, although I would like to expand it to Europe, will Europe be forced at a certain point of time to go the same road of basically defending their countries and citizens by using increasingly advanced technologies?
That is an excellent question. And it is correct. I mean, there's a big push, I mentioned this before, to integrate more AI and to automate in the military. Globally speaking, the US and China are clearly the front runners in this, but there's a couple of other countries involved, to a lesser degree. Russia, you could mention, Great Britain, France, certainly Israel, South Korea, Australia. And so, Europe and Germany, what are we to do? I, for one, would be very happy if we, in Germany and in Europe as a whole, were to develop a clear stance on the issue. And I would hope that the stance would be that we will be using this technology and that we will be developing it in a responsible manner. In fact, I've been pushing for exactly that. And obviously, due to time, I can't go into all of the details of this, but suffice it to say that there is, for instance, this one program now underway. Europe is, as we speak, running the biggest arms procurement project ever. It's called Future Combat Air System. And it's imagined to be a fighter plane surrounded by drones, and it's enmeshed in this combat cloud. So it's going from satellites to the ground, basically. Everything is connected to everything. And there is a lot of thought being put into how we as Europeans are to develop this and then later on use this in a manner that is aligned with our core values and, international humanitarian law, and to also use automation in a responsible manner. I think it can be done. And just to make this point very clear, because I think it's a common misunderstanding, this does not necessarily mean that you, militarily speaking, tie one hand behind your back. That's not necessarily the case. I think there's a good way to deal with this technology, but we need to be engaging in it also to be able, as Europeans, to have a voice in the international discussion on this.
Thank you for that vision for Europe and for the need for more discussion. Now, I'd like to have a last round looking at maybe what some of the last 18 months have told us about digital innovations in all of your fields versus, well, some form of hesitation also from certain populations, certainly here in Germany, because we have just lived through a period that imposed sudden constraints on the world, which in some cases were a catalyst for change and innovation, but also experienced some pushback. So what has the pandemic meant? What kind of an impact did the pandemic create in your field? Let's start with you, Jens Baas. What has it meant in the healthcare sector?
Well, if there's one good thing you can say about Corona, and it's really hard to use the term good thing in the same sentence as Corona, but if there's one thing, it really brought a push to the digitalization in the healthcare system. We have seen that we are certainly lacking in almost all aspects of digitalization within the healthcare system. I would always say we would have been able to deal with the pandemic much better if we were in a more advanced phase of digitalization. And the problem is, and you have to be very, very frank about that, the problem in Germany and in parts of Europe is not a technical problem. It's not that physicians don't like digital tools. It's not like health insurances don't like digital tools. It's not like people don't see the need. The problem within our society is that there are a lot of interests and a lot of people who are actually making a very good living in the healthcare system. And if you have a digital healthcare system, you kind of, well, the purpose is to create transparency. And if you have transparency, you will see what's actually working and what's not. And all the people that are afraid they might be on the side what's not are actually afraid of that transparency. So what we see in Germany is there is a lot of discussion about data privacy, a lot of discussion about technical problems. I just read in the comments that somebody was saying we still don't have an electronic patient ID, which is true. But we spent a couple of billion euros for a plastic card with your ID card on it. So total waste of money. That was done because all the interest groups were trying to protect their interests. Of course, you can't say I'm protecting my interest. So you say, well, it's for data privacy issues or stuff like that. So I think the pandemic helped in the regard that those kind of arguments are getting harder to bring to the table, and people do see the need for digitalization. They see that it's actually not the end of the world if you have something like an electronic patient record, even it's a very, very early start we do have in Germany. And I hope that we will keep that kind of movement, because we are still in a very early phase in Germany. Our digitalization of the healthcare system is way behind a lot of other countries. We need to get up here. We need to get on speed. So I hope the pandemic actually opened some people's eyes. And I also hope that the pressure by the population, the pressure by the patients to actually get the benefits of a digitalized healthcare system is actually going to be so big that the politicians will not be able to turn the time back here.
not turning back the time. Frank, Mastiaux, let's look at the energy sector. We had to basically transfer all of our work, our lives suddenly into a completely different mode. Many people had to work from home. We basically changed a lot of infrastructural foundations. What did the last 18 months do to the energy sector? What has it meant in terms of digital innovation?
Best I speak about what I clearly can judge and see in front of me, which is how people worked for example, in our company. We basically, in literally from one day to the other, put everybody from his or her desk to home office. And there was no pre-warning. And there was no wake up to the fact sort of 2-month period to get adapted. It happened literally overnight. And you would expect a breakdown in that situation. And I can tell you it was one of the positive, striking surprises to me. Nothing really broke down. People have shown an incredible ability to adapt and rapidly to think about, okay, what do I have to do? Where do I get this? And obviously it was an interplay between a prepared company as an infrastructure provider. You are almost obsessed that nothing can go wrong at any time and circumstance. So there is a mental preparedness for a sudden situation that you have to be still operating to 100% reliability, and that leaves almost a mental imprint on the people in the company that allowed them to not get worried and to allow them to adapt and get the equipment they need, get the training they need. And obviously we are, as a company, I think we did very well in supporting that. So factor number one, it worked very well. Factor number two, I've seen in a rapid learning curve in something that we shouldn't underestimate, which is the generosity of people dealing with each other in a different context. It was just not that they would, like robots, put their points out in the video conferences to the detriment of everybody else. People would very quickly figure out that this requires a different sort of patience and listening mode and all the rest of it. That was very, very well observable throughout the time and hasn't come down. Third point, I just want to echo Jens' point about the vulnerabilities in our society, in particular in the administrative sector, in the digital world, have been exposed in a way that could not be magnified more. And I think on top of the point he made, that there are obviously particular interests that would slow down and prevent digital developments for some causes. I guess it was just a symptom of complacency, that people in some parts of the society have no clue what are you up against when you are playing in a competitive sense against digital astute players. And if you never have been penalized for using a fax machine where you can still already be 3 generations ahead and have a different technology, why would you change? So I think it was a signal of simply complacency and a not very concerned attitude that we have now seen, and now everybody's trying to catch up, and I think it will be a healthy shock for the society. Hopefully people will not too quickly forget the experience they went through once we have been further down the road in management of the crisis.
A healthy shock to society. Frank Sauer, lastly, can you agree from a national security perspective? I mean, when we look at tracking and potential surveillance, etc., what have you witnessed in the last 18 months in your field?
I think I have a bit of a different example, an example where it actually, didn't really work the way it maybe did in private companies. So I mentioned before that the international community is already having an ongoing deliberation process on this notion of, AI in the military and weapon autonomy. And the focal point of these discussions is the United Nations in Geneva. And even before the pandemic, these talks, they were moving really slow, like at glacial pace. But as soon as the pandemic hit, everything was brought to a complete stillstand. And that is clearly, you were asking for the biggest impact that the pandemic had on my field of work, because I've been traveling to Geneva on a regular basis. That was a major impact. And the last year the expectation was, of course, well, then we're moving these talks online, or at least into hybrid formats. But we found out that technology is not a silver bullet. There's always societal, organizational, political variables in play. And because this venue where this thing is discussed is working on a consensus basis, if one state simply doesn't want to move these talks online, it's not happening. And so it is not happening. And that's where we are, unfortunately. We could be easily, keeping the international community's debate going via formats like this, but some states simply are not up for it. And so I think in terms of diplomacy and arms control processes and these kinds of things, we're still kind of stuck in the fax era.
Wow. So in summary, sometimes humans can also stand in the way of technology working for us. But as we heard this morning, sometimes we also actually direly need humans in the loop still. Well, thank you very much to this illustrative panel. Thank you to Dr. Jens Baas, Dr. Frank Mastiaux, and Dr. Frank Sauer for this lively discussion about the machines that shape us in all of your industries. Thank you so much for joining us.